Good afternoon. I'd love to be with you all in person in Louisville, but it's a great pleasure to be joining you virtually from Johannesburg. I've been studying large group awareness training since 2010, and this is the first opportunity I've really had to share my findings. So I hope that you find some of this useful, and if not, at the very least, you find some of it interesting. My presentation, as mentioned, is on large group awareness trainings, or LGATs. I'll provide more context for those of you unfamiliar with these seminars in a moment, but at a high level, and most salient to this presentation, is the fact that they generate powerful positive affective states in most participants, and secondly, that there have been consistent claims of specific forms of psychological harm since their inception in the early 1970s. To date, there hasn't been a coherent theory to explain these effects. However, I believe that the dopaminergic defense hypothesis may provide insights into both the positive, and I say positive in inverted commas, and claimed negative effects of participation. To provide a little bit more background, large group awareness training is the generic name for a type of transformational seminar popularized by organizations like EST, LifeSpring, and others in the 1970s and 1980s. LGATs tend to last for 3 to 5 days. They're extremely stressful for many participants, but they do result in a powerful high for most, which appears to last for a few days to a few weeks. Since their inception, there have been claims by participants, researchers, and others of manipulation, exploitation, psychological harm, and other negative effects. While they were certainly influenced by many groups, disciplines, and movements, Mind Dynamics produced many of what might be considered the first generation of LGAT organizations. EST and LifeSpring were two of the most prominent groups in the 1970s and 1980s. The founders of these organizations, as well as the founders of Psi seminars, actualizations, and others, were all trainers or employees at Mind Dynamics before starting their own organizations. These individuals and their seminars are not homogeneous, and they were each impacted by various other groups and movements that were prominent at the time. I've highlighted just some of these groups and movements on this slide. It appears that LifeSpring seminars were the most widely replicated or copied, and among the dozens of current LGATs I've read about or been told about, most use processes almost identical to those used by LifeSpring. Mastery and Transformational Training, a Los Angeles-based organization, for example, appears to be little more than LifeSpring with a new name. The LGAT that I took part in Durban, South Africa in 2010 was almost identical to the LifeSpring basic training, although there were elements taken directly from EST. And perhaps most topically, the LGATs currently being used on vulnerable minors in the troubled teen industry in the US are based heavily on LifeSpring. Former LifeSpring trainer David Gilcrease created an organization called Resource Realizations, which offered seminars at many therapeutic schools and other facilities in the troubled teen industry. My review of these seminars or workshops reveals that most of their processes are identical to those used by LifeSpring. EST is perhaps the prototypical LGAT organization. It became known as Werner Erhard and Associates in the early 1980s, and then in 1991, a closely related organization, first known as Landmark Education and later Landmark Worldwide, was formed. Their flagship seminar, the Landmark Forum, is the most prevalent LGAT offered today. To provide you with some sense of just how prevalent LGATs are, consider that it's estimated that hundreds of organizations offer these seminars worldwide. Just one of these seminars, the Landmark Forum, is offered in all of the countries highlighted on this map and listed on this slide. As stated on their website, Landmark Worldwide offers the Landmark Forum in 125 cities in more than 20 countries, and over 3 million people have participated in this seminar alone. For the purposes of this presentation, it's important to consider what LGATs promise and what evidence there is to support these promises. So LGAT organizations promise participants things like miracles and lasting transformations. The emphasis on lasting should be noted. Making strong claims about the impact of participation on happiness, confidence, communication, creativity, energy, productivity, and decisiveness. Given the magnitude of their claims, peer-reviewed research should be able to clearly demonstrate their effectiveness. Scientific evidence would also elevate their sales, so it would make financial sense for these organizations to facilitate and publish high-quality research. It's telling then that after more than 50 years of these organizations being in existence, that none have published peer-reviewed research to support their very researchable claims. The lack of research on current LGATs may be because a high-quality peer-reviewed study on the Forum, which was the predecessor to the Landmark Forum, was published in 1989. This study concluded the short-term outcome analysis revealed that only perceived control was affected by Forum participation, and no long-term treatment effects were observed. To summarize, there's considerable evidence that LGATs generate short-term highs or a sense of power or confidence, but no credible evidence that they produce lasting transformations in most participants. So, moving on to the major questions that I'd like to address today. The first is, how do LGATs generate their remarkable short-term transformational experiences? To answer this question, I wanted to get as much information as I could on what takes place during an LGAT and how participants respond to these seminars. I'd experienced an LGAT myself in 2010, but I needed to ensure that my description was based on multiple independent and, when aggregated, trustworthy sources. Likewise, it's simplistic to describe the post-LGAT experience as a transformation or a high or a euphoria. It was therefore important to understand the multitude of emotions, thoughts, and behaviors consistently promised by LGAT organizations and reported by participants, researchers, and others. To do this, I reviewed numerous books, journal articles, magazine articles, blogs, and online discussion forums, and then synthesized common experiences using thematic analysis. While my Ph.D. provides a great deal more detail, the following were my major findings. LGATs involve significant stress and reward, and in most participants, this leads to a powerful state of transformation. More specifically, the first 75 to 80% of a seminar, which is about 2 to 3 days, is immensely stressful. Pages 192 to 318 of my Ph.D. explain how the stress is achieved. And the final 20 to 25% of a seminar, which is roughly a day, involves abruptly replacing the stress with a sense of love, acceptance, affirmation, and renewal, essentially social reward. As a result of participation, about 75 to 80% of participants appear to be pushed into euphoric state, which is referred to by many LGAT organizations as transformation. So the question then becomes, how is this transformational state generated? The genesis of my hypothesis came from my own experience of bipolar disorder. I was diagnosed in 2003 and participated in an LGAT in 2010. So by that time, I had a reasonably strong theoretical and practical understanding of the illness. I knew that 2 key triggers for bipolar, hypermania and mania, and those are the 2 elevated states of bipolar disorder, were psychological stress and goal attainment. And I knew what the symptoms of hypermania and mania were. Of course, and I'm sure you've picked this up, LGAT conditions mirror the 2 known triggers of hypermania and mania. And when I considered the effects of LGAT participation in terms of what we were promised, what people told me, and what I observed, these effects looked similar, if not identical, to hypermania and mania. A prominent theory for bipolar hypermania and mania is the dopamine hypothesis of bipolar disorder. So I began to investigate the relationship between LGAT conditions and dopamine, and the relationship between dopamine elevation and the multitude of described effects of LGAT participation. The first thing that the literature showed was that acute stress results in dopamine elevation, or stated differently, arousal of the seeking system. I also found that stress makes the dopamine system more sensitive to reward. It's been long known that rewarding events elicit an elevation in dopamine, so one might say that an LGAT is an incredibly extreme and abnormal environment that is perfectly designed to cause an elevation in dopamine. If then the effects of LGAT transformation aligned with the effects of dopamine elevation, then a coherent theory to at least partially explain these positive effects would exist. Before looking at common positive effects of participation, a few representative quotes may help to communicate just how good individuals feel shortly after completing an LGAT. Dr. Margaret Singer, who participated in several LGATs and interviewed dozens of participants, said the following: "Afterwards, participants have attested to feeling awesome and experiencing an emotional high that lasted for days. Some say they had to use special grounding procedures just to carry on with normal life after this transcending experience." Journalist Roland Howard says the following: "I was shaken by the power of the weekend. As I got the midnight train out of London, I realized that well over 100 people had experienced a transformation in 3 days. The sense of euphoria that such an experience of accelerated community brings was remarkable." This participant said, "Through doing the Landmark Forum, I gained a level of freedom and confidence and joy that I could not even have imagined before doing it. I've hugely improved so many areas of my life thanks to Landmark, and I would recommend it to anybody." The data analysis revealed that the following effects are consistently promised by LGAT organizations and reported by participants shortly after participation. These effects align closely with the effects of dopamine elevation, and they also align closely with the effects of hypomania. When you have a sound understanding of the experience of hypomania and depression and how they distort the way that you see the world, it's impossible to not see the effects of LGATs as a positive shift in mood. For example, when depressed, an objectively pleasant and positive world may seem dark and pessimistic to the person in question. Likewise, when hypomanic, an objectively neutral or even negative world may seem bright and full of promise. Consider then the following in light of the effects of mood on perception. These researchers say, in general, LGATs espouse the idea that people are capable of changing their lives, not so much by modifying their external circumstances, but by changing the way they interpret them. Similarly, Brewer, Finkelstein et al., and Reinhardt describe the stated purpose of the first major LGAT, EST, as to transform your ability to experience living so that the situations you have been trying to change or have been putting up with clear up just in the process of life itself. The dopaminergic defense hypothesis, therefore, provides a plausible explanation for the positive effects of LGAT participation. The second question asks whether this explanation may provide insights into the claimed negative effects of participation. While there had been multiple claims of harm from LGAT participation in the 1970s and 1980s, there was no way to clearly explain this harm in 1987. As stated by early researcher of LGATs, Professor Morten Lieberman, there's no reason to assume on the basis of the evidence we've so far been able to gather that large group awareness training could not create psychiatric risk for some. What is clearly lacking, however, is a coherent theory for linking a set of experiences ordinarily encountered in large group awareness training to the development, exacerbation, or intensification of psychopathology. You'll notice that the dopaminergic defense hypothesis is based on research that emerged after this statement was made. Analysis of the data reveals that the claimed negative effects of participation include psychosis, manic-like symptoms including extreme impulsivity, so things like excessive spending, risky business decisions, divorces shortly after participating, that kind of thing, then mood instability, depression, and even suicide. These negative effects also align with the effects of dopamine elevation or dopamine disruption. The dopamine hypothesis of psychosis, for example, is well supported in the literature. There are over 7,000 peer-reviewed articles about the relationship between dopamine and psychosis, and many antipsychotic medications, which are often used to treat bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, restrict or lower dopamine activity. While most participants appear to be pushed into an elevated state, claims of depression and even suicides have been noted. Chronic stress and stressful events have been associated with depression and suicide and with dopamine depletion. So it may be that some participants' defenses are overwhelmed through participation. LGAT organizations may protect themselves from liability with disclaimers, but these disclaimers appear to support the dopaminergic defense hypothesis. Landmark Worldwide, for example, warns, you should not participate in the program if you A, have a personal family history of bipolar affective disorder, also known as manic depressive disorder, schizophrenia, which is a psychotic disorder, acute or chronic depression, or other psychotic disorder. It's almost as if they are aware that their seminars impact the very neurotransmitters that are closely associated with these disorders. The dopaminergic defense hypothesis, therefore, provides a plausible explanation for the positive effects of participation and for many of the claimed negative effects of participation. In summary of what's been covered so far, LGATs involve significant psychological stress followed by reward or affirmation. We understand from the literature that acute psychological stress elevates dopamine. We also know that stress or homeostatic imbalance makes the dopamine system more sensitive to reward. Furthermore, we know that reward or affirmation elevates dopamine. In other words, we understand that LGAT conditions are very well suited to elevating dopamine. Then we know that the positive effects of LGAT participation align closely with the effects of dopamine elevation, and we know that many of the claimed negative effects of LGAT participation align closely with the effects of extreme dopamine elevation, a dopamine deficit, or dopamine instability. I've been describing dopamine as a defense against psychological threats, so I wanted to provide a visual explanation of this hypothesis and how dopamine is maximized in an LGAT. Under normal conditions, we'll have stresses in our lives, and we'll also have a multitude of ways of remaining in balance or of achieving psychological homeostasis. That would be our stress response, and it would be made up of psychological processes, neurobiological processes, and social processes. Things like speaking to a friend or a loved one might be considered a social mechanism by which we achieve psychological homeostasis. Under normal conditions, the moderate sense of I can't manage will be balanced out by a moderate sense of I can manage. What happens in an LGAT is that stresses are significantly magnified, and crucially, participants' access to their normal stress response processes are restricted. Participants can't sit next to the same person after a break, and they're often chastised for supporting others. They have limited access to food, they're often deprived of sleep, their sense of control is undermined, and while they are allowed to use the bathroom, there's considerable pressure to remain in the training environment at all times. Because the level of stress is so high and their normal stress response is limited, a large stress response deficit is manufactured in this artificial environment. If you've ever taken cocaine or smoked crystal meth, I won't ask for a show of hands, you may be aware of the impact of dopamine on your sense of autonomy, confidence, motivation, energy, and decisiveness. The literature shows that dopamine is elevated under stressful conditions, but dopamine also makes sense as a short-term endogenous defense against a psychological threat, particularly when our normal defenses are restricted. Under LGAT conditions, the enormous sense of I can't manage must be balanced out by an equally enormous sense of I can manage. And because other stress response processes are restricted, the dopaminergic defense must do the heavy lifting to achieve this. On the final day of the LGAT, the stress is abruptly removed and replaced with a sense of love, affirmation, and social reward. Participants at this point also regain access to the wide array of processes that contribute to the stress response, and additionally, dopamine elevates because there is a significant sense of reward. I believe that the imbalance between the metaphorical whispering of I can't manage and the metaphorical screaming of I can manage may be responsible for both the positive LGAT effects and many of the claimed negative effects of participation. I believe that the stressful LGAT conditions, lasting for 2 to 3 days, may also condition participants into a state of psychological hypervigilance, and that this may account for the duration of this transformational state. Finally, we move on to the conclusions and limitations. The dopaminergic defense hypothesis is useful, but it is limited. It provides a plausible natural mechanism by which LGATs generate their positive effects and by which many of the claimed negative effects are caused. It is, however, currently a hypothesis, and empirical evidence is required to assess its veracity. Additionally, it's simplistic to claim that dopamine explains all of the effects of LGAT participation, even if we're only considering neurobiological explanations. For example, social stresses also elevate endogenous opioids and oxytocin, both of which may help to explain some of the experience of LGAT participants. The second major point is that the impact of a powerful experience on influence should be considered. LGATs spend a lot of time devaluing critical thinking and elevating experience as the supreme way of knowing anything. For them to then trigger a powerful experience and point to it as evidence of their doctrine and obligations is to surreptitiously undermine autonomy and take advantage of an illegitimate and manufactured form of evidence. Finally, the application of this hypothesis to other cult-like groups and even possibly to some mainstream religious groups should be considered. Many use processes to generate guilt, inadequacy, and fear. Scientology's auditing processes come to mind. And then other processes by which that stress is abruptly removed and replaced with a sense of love, acceptance, affirmation, renewal, or forgiveness, what Robert J. Lifton may have referred to as dispensing of existence. If groups are using processes to generate significant psychological stress and other processes to remove that stress and provide a sense of love and affirmation and that sort of thing, and if that process leads to some sort of experience, then the dopaminergic defense hypothesis may help to explain that experience. That brings me to the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.